You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O, Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to have Jeffrey Cranor on the show with me. He has an amazing new book. It's called You Feel It Just Below the Ribs. And this, if you are a fan of Jeffrey's podcast of Welcome to Night Vale or Within the Wires, you're going to love this book. And this is on my recommended gift giving list this season as we're going into Christmas and the gift giving season. This is something that will definitely be on your list for book lovers in your life. Welcome to the show, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Hank. I'm glad to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Jeffrey, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I think it was in fifth grade where they sort of planted the seed. I remember reading I'm going to get this title wrong, but it's like Alexander's No Good, Terrible, Very Bad Day, like classic
I remember that
grade school book. And
Yes.
we had read that, and it was funny or whatever, and I ended up making my own version of the book. So I just did a parody of not parodying the book, but just kind of parodying my own life of my own dumb, stupid, dorky day or whatever. I forget what I titled it, but it was just about my own life. And I sort of gave it to a friend of mine in class, and he thought it was funny. And then our teacher, Mrs. Hall, wanted to read it, and she thought it was funny, and she asked my permission to read it for the class. So she offered me to read it in front of the class, and I was too embarrassed, and she did, and everyone laughed, and I was like, this was fun. This seems like a fun thing to do. And it really didn't set in until much later that it was a thing you could actually do, until I was like in high school and started writing for the high school newspaper and was like, oh yeah, writing articles, plays, whatever. I would love to write some things and have people read them.
That's an amazing answer. And several things in that I want to ask you about. First off, the idea of a parody and not necessarily parodying the story like you said, but parodying life and the way that you see things, and the interesting way that you observe the world and then spin it into these fantastical kind of stories. And any of us that have followed your other work, your podcast and things like that, will pick up on this kind of sense of parodying the reality and putting a fun spin on it, but and also a spin that gets us to thinking about things. Where do you think that love of parody and taking and kind of an askew glance at the world, where do you think that comes from?
I think I was always drawn to comedy, even as a kid. Like I just liked funny things. I grew up on, like a lot of kids in the 80s, grew up on Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers and Electric Company and kids shows like that. And I was always really drawn to Sesame Street because of the Muppets, right? There was just a level of goofy humor that I think I was always more drawn to. And as I got older, I don't know. There's just something about, like, maybe it was the friends I was with, the people I was around. I think my family always sort of appreciated comedy, good joke telling, things like that. So, yeah, leaning that direction. And in junior high and high school, I found Dave Barry. Like, my grandparents had a bunch of like humorists on their bookshelf, people like Irma Bombeck and Louis Grizzard and Dave Barry and people like that. So I don't know. I just started gravitating towards that. It seemed fun to take existing material and kind of like turn it on its head. Kind of repurpose something to see if you can find a different type of humor in that. Weird Al was a big thing when I was a kid too.
Oh yeah, for sure. What part of the country did you grow up in, Jeffrey?
I grew up near Dallas in a suburb named Mesquite. So I grew up in just east of Dallas. Yeah, just kind of like a little cozy suburb with a giant mall on the outer
Right.
interstate loop. Yeah.
So I love to ask people because I find that that pops up in interesting ways in a lot of people. This idea of a sense of place and how it affects us, and sometimes it affects us directly, and people write stories based in and around the places that they grew up and had the most impact on them. But sometimes it comes out in subtle ways in the relationships between people in a particular place, or some of the more subtle under the surface things. Do you feel like growing up in East Texas has affected you in any sort of way, maybe obvious or not obvious?
Yeah, I think just sort of growing up in kind of a generic suburb, like it felt uneventful to me. I think this is kind of a story of a lot of people of the Gen X generation too. Of like you grow up in kind of a homogenized suburb, and you
Yeah,
watch television and films, and you're like, this is not my experience here. So you get a lot of vicarious experience through art. And it's not to say that growing up in a suburb is entirely a homogenous experience. I think that's been changing a lot. But I think for me it was a matter of there was just kind of a blank slate to the suburbs that you could sort of lay whatever you wanted on. And I think I was sort of drawn towards absurdity. I really loved it when shows like Erie, Indiana, or Parker Lewis Can't Lose, or Twin Peaks came about, because they kind of took these like humdrum towns and made them seem way more exciting than they actually were. That you could just put strange monsters or weird people or just bizarre camera angles, and kind of make something seem more exciting than it was.
was that sort of the impetus that brought Night Vale to life? This idea of kind of small mundane places that have something more going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, I think I channeled a lot of my Mesquite into Night Vale. Like I definitely like there's certain like street names and locations that just felt like that I could just slide to Night Vale when I write episodes. And yeah, I think that's what it was, is that what made Night Vale really fun to write as a counterbalance to my growing up in Mesquite was, one, is like layering the weird onto the mundane, but two, I think what makes Night Vale sort of interesting for me was always like kind of aspirational writing a town where people listen to the community radio station, however flawed the narrative might be coming out
Sure.
of that station. But I think it was this thought that like people care about the city council and people care about what's happening in their town, that people sort of like rally together, maybe in Independence Day style, but also maybe just in local politics. They're doing bake sales, and even if it's to support the blood space war, it's still like we're actively involved in our schools, we're actively involved in our PTAs and our city councils, in building rec centers, things like that. And I think that was an experience I didn't really have growing up. I didn't really observe that type of like community interaction. There were parents that came to school events, of course, but I didn't really sense this kind of like rah rah our town type of thing.
Gotcha. A lot of people, Jeffrey, have this innate, ingrained sense of storytelling in them, like you described, that from an early age, kind of feeling this draw. But then also, like you said, you go to college and getting into life and realize, oh yeah, there's this thing that maybe I'll start working on this, or see where it goes. W- Very few people I've met, and we've done 1,200 episodes of this podcast, and
Wow.
very few people had a singular focus that about being a storyteller, and that the only thing that they concentrated on in college, and then working after that was telling the story and getting published. And most people have, stories of having this thing inside them, but then also having to deal with life and starting a family and all the great things, about life that come around. And then storytelling has a way of working itself back into their life. What was your experience?
I think that's a pretty close summation of how I went about it, because I was really interested in the arts, really interested in writing. When I got into college, I got really into theater. I wasn't an actor, and I wasn't really really good at tech or painting sets or anything like that. So I really got intrigued with playwrights, and studied a lot of like theater history, things of that nature. I think it really never occurred to me that you could do that for a living, if that makes any sense. Like, I knew people wrote for a living, but how to go about it was so hard. And like you said, you have to live your life. So I got a full-time job doing fundraising for a dance company in Dallas, after I graduated, and I worked in nonprofit arts fundraising for more than a decade after that. And I kind of started figuring out that you could do small things. You wouldn't get paid really for them, but I started working with smaller theater companies and, doing 24-hour playwriting things or whatever, and, small little festivals. And I found that it was really hard even to submit work to get produced. And so what I started doing was finding groups that just wanted to get together and do their own thing, and you just sort of self-produce. And I did that for a good decade and a half before I even got to making Night Vale.
So Night Vale is very much akin to putting on a play, but it's old style radio drama, which I absolutely love. And then writing a novel is a different muscle in the storytelling skeleton that you get to flex. They're all connected, but they manifest in different ways. First off, what was it that enamored you so much to playwrights and to the art form of writing for performance?
I think it was just seeing everything come to life, hearing other, going back to that fifth grade experience. It was really interesting hearing somebody else read my writing out loud. I didn't think about it at the time, but I think looking back, I think that had a really big impact on me. That something you wrote, you didn't have to be present for it. You didn't have to do it. You wrote a thing and you got to see somebody else embody the thing that you wrote. And you can kind of listen to a performer, in this case, Mrs. Hall, my fifth grade teacher in Porter Elementary. I wasn't really that critical. I was sort of embarrassed and ecstatic that she was doing this. But as I go on with life, you sort of like figure out how to like shape how it's all consumed. I like that there's just so many moving parts, and I like that you get to see it come to life on stage. There's something really fun about that. And theater, I just found, above all, is so immediate. It's a thing that you can only experience right there in the room. And it felt like a puzzle to me to try and write a play, to try and figure out, like, you can't explain everything you want to explain. You need to write short dialogue that responds to the moment rather than just writing jokes, if that makes any sense.
Sure. Dabble is a proud sponsor of Author Stories. Dabble is an easy-to-use cloud-based writing tool that gives writers a way to organize, plot, and create amazing stories wherever they are. Write in our desktop app, on your Mac or Windows computer, tablet, or mobile device. Dabble syncs your latest version with the cloud on all your devices. Write anywhere and anytime inspiration strikes. We got you. Dabble is my preferred writing tool, and I think it will be yours as well. Visit dabblewriter.com for your free trial. You have an amazing story idea. You execute the writing and editing flawlessly, and now the only thing missing are readers. We can help you go from author to author superhero with Story Origin. Story Origin is a one-stop shop for marketing tools with a community of amazing authors working together to find reviewers, build mailing lists, increase sales, and collect feedback from beta readers. Everything an author needs, all in one place, from providing review copies or beta copies, reader magnets to ensure you stay connected with readers, easily distribute audio promo codes, universal retail links to send readers directly to the proper point of purchase, or provide direct download links for members of your mailing list. Story Origin has all the tools you need in one easy-to-use site. Use the promo code ASP21 at checkout when subscribing to the yearly plan, and you will get 10% off your first year. This code will expire December 31st, so hurry over and subscribe now. StoryOriginApp.com.
I think of it, and tell me if this is right or not, but I have some friends that are stand-up comics, and we've talked about the idea of, if you're a novelist, you're going to spend the majority of a year by yourself working on this manuscript, and it's going to be you and the manuscript for a long time. And then you're going to bring in an editor, maybe some beta readers, different people that you can kind of bounce the story off of, and you get feedback, and then the editorial process is a new process in this creation, and you go through that, and then when we have a book that we're holding in our hands, that's been through several stages of the process. When you're a stand-up comic, or if you were a stage actor, I would think that you get kind of editorial feedback in real time. Whether this joke lands, or whether in this particularly emotional scene in this play, is the audience reacting the way I want them to. And then maybe the next night you put this show on, you are making adjustments. How do you feel like the process of writing for stage or performing on stage and writing a novel, even though they're huge similarities, there's some real differences in those two forms, isn't there?
There are, yeah. The writing alone, and you do have other people that can read the thing, but you don't have the visceral feedback that you do when you're a stand-up comic. Novel writing, at least, while that's a little bit more complicated to figure out exactly how the reader is going to consume your writing, how well the pacing goes, how well the story flows for them, how much they want to not put the book down or just give up on the book altogether. It's so hard to know that because you don't have the immediate response. But that being said, I do find novel writing is a bit more forgiving, that people will grant you more latitude. Anything on stage has to be, everything is vitally important. And I'm not saying that in novel writing you can just kind of riff for however long you want. I just read a novel. I don't know why I completed the whole thing, but it's 600 pages long, and the first 300 pages, like, a bunch of stuff is introduced that never gets paid off, and it was it was a real slog. And I found that I made my way through it because I kind of just enjoyed being immersed in the world that the author was creating. And so that's a thing that's a little harder to get away with in theater and in stand-up comedy, because we're not there for immersion. We're there for immediacy. We're there for you telling me the story. So it kind of, it's six dozen one way, half dozen the other. But I always think about cooking when I think about creating art at all. Like, the longer you do it, the more you learn what things are supposed to taste like, and what tastes good. And sometimes I get to the point where I don't have to taste certain foods that I make, because I do taste them, but like, I know what it's going to taste like the moment I put the spoon to my mouth, before I serve it. And I think the same thing can happen with writing and with stand-up comedy. When a joke is going to kind of land, and it's just a matter of refining it to the point where it will land every time that you do it. And I think with novel writing, you just don't quite have that immediate. There's no one sitting around the table with you to be like, this tastes great, because it's just so hard to hand off 400 pages to somebody and be like, hey, read this and give me your thoughts. That's not a thing they can do in a 45-minute set.
Right. I love that you described reading that novel as a bit of a slog, but you enjoyed being in the world, and that's not for nothing. World building is incredible, and yes, we want our stories to pay off. Absolutely, the things that we promise in the beginning, you need to make sure you resolve in the end. But there is something to be said about world building and letting your readers just enjoy being in the place that you've created. As someone who has created, fantastical worlds with Night Vale, etc., um, when you're dealing with a long running property like a podcast like Night Vale, um, how much of I guess what I'm asking is when you're dealing with a project like that, your world building is essential. You want people to be there and be comfortable there and want to come back to that world. Yet as a storyteller that there needs to be payoffs as you go, especially with something that is going to be ongoing and continuously running. How do you judge those payoffs and keep the world open for the story to continue?
With Night Vale, one thing that's really great about it is because we're approaching 200 episodes of this show, we kind of can just sort of do whatever we want, with the idea that continuity has to be a thing. This isn't The Simpsons, right? Where Bart is the same age as he was 25 years ago, or
Right.
whatever, however long we're into the 22 years. But people grow and age and change. They die, they get married, they get sick, they move, they get different jobs, whatever. And I think that we can play around with plot versus character, not as if they're in opposition to each other, as one supports the other. So I could write an episode that's just kind of like a one-off little story, and it's about some crazy adventure. And because the characters have already been built up over the years that we've done the show, the characters can kind of support this like wild hijinks, like a little heist story or something like that. But then sometimes I realize like, oh, I can just make a story that I can make an episode or two that is really just about the characters, just to play around with language, to play around with like, here's just 25 minutes you can spend with these people. And there's some plot in there, but the plot is really just about watching the characters or listening to the characters grow and develop. And I think, to use the example of growing up in Mesquite, Texas, like Mesquite is not a place I would ever suggest anyone move to. It's not a place I would ever want to live again. That being said, I think you can live almost anywhere in the world. Like think of the most boring town you can possibly think of. But if you lived on a block where you liked your neighbors, I think you'd really have a great time. And I think that's a big part of books one thing I have always loved about somebody like Stephen King. We can nitpick all of his bad endings, but I think a Stephen King novel, the thing that I think we underrate about his writing ability is his ability to immerse you in whatever town you're in. And
Right.
that's just where you're at. Like we're there for the thrills, we're there for the scares, we're there for his like pretty flat archetypes that he uses, but at the same time I'm like, I'm having a great time. I don't know what to tell you, but this is fun, and I enjoy I enjoy being this character. I like being harassed by greasers or whatever. So it's fine. This is cool. I like that. And I think that's a part that I have to often remind myself to get to plot, because I become enamored with characters. I really like being surrounded by interesting or delightful or complicated people.
Well, and I think you're absolutely right about Stephen King. Is the genius of his writing is the ability to hand you characters that you might know, or these are people that, um, this is the man that lives down the street from me, or this is the woman that I, bump into in the grocery store, and you just never know what's going on there. And I think that's what's the I don't think it gets talked about enough with his writing and people that try to imitate his writing. There's a lot there that everyone can study and pick up on for sure.
Yeah.
So you feel it just below the ribs as your new novel. How does this tie into existing properties that you've worked on?
Well, my co-writer Janina Matthewson and I write a podcast called Within the Wires. It's another fiction podcast. It's very different from Night Vale. It's
Right.
not humorous. It is more sci-fi, super immersive podcast. So the way that we do Within the Wires, the podcast is we're in our 6th season. Each season is 10 episodes, all about 20 minutes or so long each, and each season it's an anthology series. So each season is its own standalone story. They're all set in the same world, which is this alternate 20th century timeline that sort of imagines at the beginning of the 20th century, kind of around the time we would have had the First World War. There was an event instead called the Great Reckoning that would have been a much more massive global warfare that also combined with a more unstoppable flu pandemic, as well as some climate changey sort of things of the weather and things of that happening. So it sort of imagines a cataclysm at the first part of the 20th century that took the world about 40 years to recover from. And then a new society was formed that was like a global government. It is sort of a utopic socialist society, but with its deeper flaws of corruption and oppression and things that happen below the surface. But that's sort of the backdrop to each of the seasons of Within the Wires. That is always kind of like a looming thing of like, what is this great reckoning? What is this new society? And it's just the people that live in this world. And some seasons, like the first, was told entirely through relaxation cassettes, where you are the person being given relaxation cassettes, and you realize that over these 10 episodes that the narrator of the cassettes is actually trying to help you escape from the medical prison that you're in. And we did one season. Each season is a form of found audio. One season was all voicemails between a young woman and her girlfriend, and it kind of it's more of a romantic comedy, but with a little bit of political intrigue underneath all of that. So play with characters, play with immersion into very specific one-on-one relationships was kind of what we did Within the Wires, which has been really fun to kind of hold to this motif of found audio, that the whole season needs to be from that type of found audio. Um, you feel it just below the ribs with Janina and I writing this novel, and we set it in the world of this alternate 20th century, of this great reckoning and new society. But what we did was, rather than found audio, because it is a novel, it is a found manuscript that has been annotated by an unnamed group or person that is sort of calling into question the veracity of this manuscript. It's very, kind of calls back to something like Pale Fire was an inspiration for how we structured the book. But yeah, it was we just wanted to make a standalone story, just like each of our other seasons, and kind of talk about what it means to be a scientist, what it means to make a process by which you can help people deal with trauma and pain and memory and things like that, and kind of talk a little bit about how good inventions sometimes can be turned bad. So that was kind of the starting point from which we began writing this novel.
By playing with the idea or the tool of the found manuscript that then is being gone over by other people, and bringing into question some things, you get to then play with the idea of an unreliable narrator, or with the reader kind of being off put and not knowing who's telling the truth, what is real, what is not. That's a fun mechanic to play with, isn't it?
I love it. I think it's great. I think it's so hard to know what truth is. In the book, we deal a lot with what value memory even has. That memory is so fallible. Memory almost like oxidizes when you expose it to the air and to the light, and it becomes something that it wasn't before. The more you think about a memory, the more untrue it sort of becomes. And I think the same thing could be said for anybody narrating their own experience or somebody else's experience. the game of telephone comes to mind, or just the way urban legends spread, or something like that. Yeah, it's really it's something I've always been interested in. It's pretty. I'm a big believer that all narrators are unreliable narrators. Like, I don't even have to make that its own subgenre. But it felt fun to draw attention to the unreliable narrator in this book by creating two different narrators, and it's not epistolary. It's not them arguing with each other. One is unaware that the other even exists. And
Right.
so, yeah, playing with that, and it puts the reader, I think, in a position not only to just read a story, but also to constantly question details of the story. And I hope that our hope was sort of that gets reflected back on how we think about our own stories in our own lives.
When you have something like Within the Wires, that's a long running property that has a kind of a fully fleshed out world that it creates, and you have all of these characters that live within that. How does a character or a particular storyline present itself to you as the writer that that this needs to be spun off? There's more to be told here that needs the form of a novel to really flesh it out and to go different places than you could than you can with an audio drama. Like, how did this come to kind of present itself to you and your co-writer Janina, that this should be a different thing?
I think some of it is just selfish enjoyment, right? You're just like, I'd like to write a novel, and hopefully somebody will make it. And when from my experience writing novels set in the Night Vale universe, Within the Wires does not have nearly the size of the audience that Night Vale has, but it has a decent, pretty good audience. And I think knowing how the publishing industry works, I sort of, if you already have followers on Twitter, you already have something that you're doing that is drawing attention to what you do. I think publishers are way more interested in what you're pitching because they know you have a built-in audience that will help them sell their book. So that's the financial, really like just cynical capitalist way of looking at that. But when you're trying to do this for a living, you're like, you have to think through things like that. So we sort of knew that. With our relationship to HarperCollins, Harper Perennial is the imprint there that we published through. Those folks, they're awesome and great, and I knew that I would have like an open phone line, metaphorically speaking, to be like, hey, I have an idea. You want to hear this idea? And they got really excited about it, and that was really fun. So that's part of it, is just knowing that you have an avenue to get there. That's an advantage, and it's great, and we wanted to use that. And two, the thing we can't do in our podcast Within the Wires is kind of go any time before the invention of audio recording. So, I guess you could do old Thomas Edison cylinders or whatever, or Victrolas, but like it just doesn't. We just didn't have anything quite there yet, and so we've played kind of with everything from like late 50s on, after the invention of magnetic tape. And so this gave us the opportunity to say, you could have somebody born in the early 20th century and live their whole life and tell their entire life story. And the manuscript is found after they've died. And you can tell the story of somebody on the ground living through the Great Reckoning, what was happening during that time, what was happening as the world started pulling itself back together, what were they doing with themselves. And throughout it all, the politics of it is always kind of in the background. The history of our fictional timeline is always sort of in the background, but it just gives us a chance to like explore people during this time in a way that we cannot actually do on the podcast without breaking the conceit of the show.
When folks are hearing this episode, You Feel It Just Below the Ribs is going to be available to purchase everywhere, and there's links to it in the show notes where you can get a Kindle edition or hardcover or audiobook. Jeffrey, because you are so ingrained in audio production, and these worlds that you've created have begun as audio dramas, How do you approach, or how do you feel about the audiobook production of a book like You Feel It Just Below the Ribs?
I think I was really annoying to poor Caitlin over at Harper Audio. She's been doing this for years, producing audiobooks through them, and she knows what she's doing. And I've worked with her a couple of times, and she's fantastic. And I definitely sent her a couple of emails being like, "Hey, I have. How are you doing this? How are we doing this? How are you handling the footnotes? Because there's footnotes, and also here's a list of a bunch of people that I want as a narrator because I love audiobooks. I've listened to a ton, and I just and she was great about it and kind of answered all my questions, and I really appreciated that. And the top two people that we wanted to narrate the book, Kirsten Potter and Adapara Aduye, both said, "Yep, sure, great," and they narrated. I just yesterday finally got the audiobook and started listening to it. I obviously haven't plowed through the whole thing, but it's great. It's really wonderful. They did a fantastic job. We found it was important to me to find two voices that were very different from each other,
Right.
because you're going to have footnotes throughout. You're going to have these moments where there is no, like, you can't see the people. So when another person starts talking, you need to know immediately who they are and what they're doing here. And so you need to know who the meta narrator is, and you need to know who Miriam is. And I was really happy with how distinct those two actors made their voices, made their styles, made their acting choices. And with audiobooks as compared to audio fiction podcasts, it's much more straight away. Like, it's much more just straight, get the words out. So your acting choices has to be so much more subtle. And I was really pleased with how great a job they did. And I was really worried about footnotes in an audiobook. And I think it came together really, really well. It feels like two people in conversation more than it does like an interruption in the flow of the story. And I thought that really came together great.
Well, I just got the audio arc from HarperCollins as well yesterday. I think it was last night when I got the email, and I've read the book in arc form, and now I'm super excited to listen to it and just experience it in that way. I definitely recommend everyone use the links in the show notes, grab it in Kindle edition or hardcover or audiobook if you want to experience that way. It's available everywhere now when you're hearing this. Jeffrey, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the amazing stuff that you do, where can they find you and connect with you online?
The easiest place is going to be to find me on Twitter, and my handle is HappierMan, HappierMan. So you can find me Happier Man on Twitter, and I try and do my best to talk about the things that I've got going on, and a lot of that is podcasting. So Within the Wires and Welcome to Night Vale. I also do a chat show with my friend Cecil, wherein we talk about horror movies. It's called Random Number Generator Horror Podcast number 9, wherein Cecil's a big horror fan, and I've always been horror movie averse, and we've been doing this for about a year and a half now, where I've watched 80 movies. It's been great. And we randomly figure out which movie we're going to watch next, so that we're not handpicking, that we are kind of all over the map. And it's been an absolute blast. So, I talk horror movies more in the last year than I ever have in my entire life put together. So check that out. But yeah, Twitter, Happier Man is going to be the way to go.
That is fantastic. We'll link up all those places in the show notes of this episode to make it easier for folks to find you. Jeffrey, this has been so much fun chatting. We're going to send everyone to pick up their copy of You Feel It Just Below the Ribs. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you, Hank. Thank you, too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
No use crying over spilled milk. Eliza hated that cliché. She'd grown up a cliché, her life a bowl of cherries, duck soup, easy as pie, child's play behind a white picket fence. Mother had been the Wyatt Earp of clichés, firing them off quick draw. A rotten apple spoils the barrel. Smile and the world smiles with you. Every dog has his day. Children should be seen and not heard. She believed them all, particularly this last. Eliza obliged, preferring to wander the streets of Wytheville, Virginia, on her own lonesome terms. The divorce left Laura a spinster librarian, and one false step on icy stairs left her an invalid as well. The accident happened on New Year's Eve, 1950. Laura had just locked the doors of Wytheville Public Library. "We must make black-eyed peas tomorrow," Laura had been thinking, "with turnip greens. That ensured a lucky new year, and if you swept some money over your threshold, a prosperous one, too." She loved those old Southern traditions. She looked both ways, checking for Negroes, but turned to heel on the icy marble of the stairs and fell into the bushes below, breaking the long bones in both legs. Eliza had taken advantage of her mother's absence. She'd lost her virginity that same night. She'd swept Ron Partridge over her threshold, initiating her own beloved tradition. She was nursing a hangover, giddily reliving the event. But around 8:30 she realized that her mother had not come down to breakfast. She checked her mother's bedroom, found it empty, took the bus down to the library, climbed the high stairs, knocked hard on the library doors, and heard a groan below. Laura lay under the William Penn barberry bushes, below the yellow-trimmed windows of the non-fiction section. Her white stockings ran Jezebel red with blood. Sweat and melted snow had soaked her blouse, and her gray forehead blazed. The broken bones didn't kill Laura Merrick. She lay in the hospital, wheezing, her legs mortared up in casts. She had few visitors after the first week. Her church group was glad to fret over a poor thing for a day or two, but they trickled away when Laura had the bad manners to linger. On Valentine's Day, as her mother slept, Eliza drew big, sloppy hearts on her casts. Laura harumphed when she woke and insisted on keeping her legs hidden beneath blankets afterwards. But in late March, something miraculous happened. Laura's self-control dropped. She ranted at nurses, spit at doctors, swore like a Navy pilot dropping F-bombs on Hiroshima. She had dementia, the doctors said. Eliza decided that her mother had just stopped believing her own bullshit. The spells continued over the next 2 weeks, and Eliza enjoyed her mother's company for the first time. They swapped bawdy jokes, ogled the handsome interns, and chattered like best girlfriends late into the evening. They had long conversations, and Laura spoke her own mind in her own words about things that mattered to her. It broke Eliza's heart when the prim, condescending librarian returned. Laura hardly acknowledged anything that had passed between them. The clichés returned. You can't have your cake and eat it too. A leopard doesn't change its spots. Nothing is certain except death and taxes. This last proved true. On April 15th, Laura Merrick marked her Bible with a tongue depressor, set it on her nightstand, leaned back against the headboard, and coughed blood down the front of her nightdress. Eliza found her that way, dead as the proverbial doornail, and yes, the blood was thicker than water, just as her mother had always said. Much thicker than water, in fact, perhaps as thick as molasses in January.